The first novelty that we're going to be talking in detail about is the feather. Now, feathers are a defining feature of birds, of course. When you think of birds, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is feathers. They have a number of other features that could also be considered key innovations, but perhaps nothing is more important. Maybe not perhaps. I make a very strong case that feathers are the main key innovation for birds. Now, birds are a last living remnant of the dinosaurs. So they are a member of the theropod dinosaur group, a group which also includes T-Rex, Velociraptor, Compsognathus, all of these two-legged carnivorous dinosaurs that were a very important component of the Mesozoic ecosystem. And they were an important part of dinosaurs, but there were many, many other dinosaurs as well. And birds were just one small part of that until that large meteorite, which hit about 65, 66 million years ago. It killed off most of the dinosaurs and many of the other large and long-term successful diapsid groups. Now, this feature that we typically think of as so bird-like, we actually now have a very, very good understanding of its origin. So although this is certainly a novelty because it allowed birds and other theropod dinosaurs to do things that their ancestors couldn't have, gave them new functions, new capabilities, it's not as much of a mystery. In fact, very little mystery remains. We're starting to even work on the very, very fine details about the origin and diversification and evolution of the feathers. Now, we don't have enough time, or probably not even the interest, to go over those in gory detail, but we are going to be hitting some of the highlights and giving you an overview of what we know about the feather. So feathers originated as a modification of dermal scales. And dermal scales are another novelty that define the ancient reptiles. And many birds still have a fairly good portion of their body on their feet and their legs that are still covered by these dermal scales. This is a chicken foot. And you look at it, and if you're familiar with chickens, you look at it right away and say, oh yeah, that's a chicken foot, and they're used in some forms of cooking and are even considered a delicacy. I look at it and think, oh, that looks like a dragon or a dinosaur hand of some sort. So they really do have this very typical scaly reptile-like structure. And they originate as outgrowths from the lower layer of the skin, the dermis. Okay, they're not epithelial, they're dermal in origin, and they then come out, and the epithelium is between the scales, and the scales perform a number of functions, just protection. Also, they allow a little bit of waterproofing, so that this was the main innovation that allowed the transition from water onto land. And then, of course, today in the birds, these have been incredibly differentiated into modern-day feathers. And so we're going to look at that process and give you an overview of our understanding of that process. Now, I've posted a paper in the paper section from 2015 that goes into tons and tons of detail about this. If you're interested, you can go over and read that, but we're going to hit the highlights here so you will know the things that you need to know regarding the origin of feathers. So feathers begin as a standard outgrowth of the integument. Again, it's dermal in origin, so notice that the epithelial layer, this epidermis, is over the deeper dermal layer. But then there are these signals that begin a growth, an outgrowth of the dermis. And eventually the epidermis will be lost over these largest ones. Sometimes it remains as a very fine, thin layer, but it remains in the space between the scales. Now, this is a feather growing. The early scales would grow out and then would spread out side to side rather than continuing to grow out so far. So the feather is a modification, and we call that initially a bud. So the small bud that would grow into a scale and eventually a feather in the theropod dinosaurs will then progress to a more mature stage called the follicle, right? And that then will differentiate into different types of feathers. And so we're going to look at that in some detail. Now, feathers are a key innovation. They allow for many, many things, but you need to know the three main functions of feathers. If you've had my evolution class, you might be having a little bit of deja vu because we talk about it there. So feathers have three main functions, and you can see all of these in modern birds. Some birds actually use all three to a fairly large extent. but the original function of feathers was almost certainly as a display for some sort of communication, either as a threat saying, hey, look how big and scary I am, or as a mating display saying, look how attractive I am, I have bright colors. But that's almost certainly, based on their distribution and size, what the first feathers were used for. After that, feathers evolved more of a complicated structure, and they evolved the ability to serve for thermal regulation, to help prevent heat loss and insulate a warm-blooded organism from the outside world. Okay, so thermal regulation is the second function of feathers. And then finally, of course, what we typically think of as the main function of feathers, but really was the third thing along the way, is their modifications in ways that allow them to provide a light, flat surface for lift, for flight, right? In the wing feathers and the primary feathers, and we'll look at that just a little bit here later on. Okay, so number one is display or communication. Number two, thermal regulation, and number three, the ability to fly. Now, as early bird embryos develop, there are these very clear areas in their body that have different signals, different transcription factors that are expressed in those areas that define different regions of the bodies that grow very distinct feathers. So this is taken from data from a zebra finch, but notice how head and even ear feathers on certain parts of the head are quite morphologically distinct from one another. And so these regions of feather growth are called tracts. So they are defined regions. They can be of various sizes, various distribution of the body that grow a certain distinct type of feather. Okay? And these can be defined. So if you know birds, you can often identify a region of the body simply by looking at where the feather came from. And perhaps for you, the most familiar tract may be these primary and secondary flight feathers, right? So these have very distinct, different shape from other feathers, and they serve a very different function. So in early forms, the scale did have some differentiation. Some were flat and more trapezoidal. Others were more like an oval and maybe a little bit more extended from the body, but there wasn't a ton of differentiation. So birds really have taken this to the next level. Within these tracts, then the next step is bud formation, and this is called induction. And induction is done by a gene called sonic hedgehog. Now, as we are looking at these genes, I'm not going to ask you the specific gene name. I don't care that you memorize the genes. We will be mentioning them and talking about them. But much more important than the specific genes in this case are the basic overall pattern and how feathers form. So we get tract defining a region or an area of the body to be a certain particular type of feathers. We then get a universal signal comes on in all of those tracts that defines bud growth. And notice the buds are fairly regularly and predictably spaced. And each of these buds will eventually grow into a feather. And if this is in the neck, there'll be those fine kind of plumose feathers that plumose feathers, it's a little bit redundant, but that are for insulation and maybe protection of the body. If this is in the wing, then they may grow into different shapes and be primary flight feathers. Okay. So after induction, we define the anterior and posterior axis. So remember, we talked about secondary fields. Each of these buds becomes its own little secondary field with a clear distinction between the anterior and the posterior. And then eventually, the proximal and distal axis becomes defined, right? So proximal distus and distal axis, and feather growth goes in fairly extreme fast growth in the distal axis, and we get growth out. And then finally, and this is where it gets really complicated in detail, and we won't get into much, but we'll just kind of skim over it here on the next slide. Finally, then we get the formation of all of these complicated shapes that will eventually unfold and become these very complex feather structures. Okay, so we have in feathers the same genes that are expressed in scales, but at different levels and in more complicated patterns. So again, if you want to look at wingless or Wnt signaling, not signaling, this is bone morphogenetic protein, which has other functions, thus its name, but serves an important function in feather formation also. That these are also expressed in regular dermal scales, but at different levels and in much more complicated structures. So you don't need to memorize the names of those genes, but you should know that it's the same old genes defining scales, just slightly different patterns and doing new things. So same basic networks, new function for those gene networks. And there's a signaling network back and forth between these genes that allows them to set up these complex patterns. So sonic hedgehog, which is the initial definer of those bud regions, signals to bone morphinage genetic protein, which then has other downstream targets. And it gets very complicated very fast as we develop this structure. And so multiple levels in multiple axes then, and in 3 dimensions, it's a little tricky to see. The paper has a lot of information about this. If you're interested, you can look at it. But as long as you know we're using those same genes in multiple levels with more complicated signaling, and then those, depending on the complexity of these signalings and how many different axes and patterns we set up, we can get different types of feathers that are defined from that. Okay. Now, we typically, again, think of feather as a defining bird feature, but really it's a theropod dinosaur feature. So it evolved early in the ancestors of the theropod dinosaurs, and almost certainly, although we don't have direct evidence for every single species, because for many of them we only have bones, but for the ones where we do have additional evidence, there's always evidence of feathers. So if we have soft tissue preservation, we see feathers. And so almost certainly all theropod dinosaurs, at least at one stage or another of their life, and maybe throughout their life, had feathers. And so this has led to a major revision of the way that we have looked at our theropod dinosaurs. In fact, I always talk about this in my evolution class. If you remember, I'm going to pull up, let's take a look here at what we view Velociraptor. By the way, Velociraptor, the species, is about the size of a turkey. So they weren't really that big. There are other raptor species that were nearly as big as the ones in the Jurassic Park movies. But this is a kind of a disservice, I think, that Steven Spielberg did. And he maybe can be given a little bit of a break because much of this was discovered during and a little bit after the first Jurassic Park movies. But even then, like in Jurassic World, they made the velociraptors look pretty close to the original ones, when in reality, this is what velociraptors look like. So this is, again, the kind of typical Jurassic Park Steven Spielberg version of a velociraptor, right here. Bring that up. Right, and you look at that and say, oh yeah, I remember that from the movie. But in reality, they would have been turkey-sized and would have looked much more like this. They were very voracious predators, but on a little bit of a smaller scale than in the movie. And they were covered with feathers. It would have looked like a really scary kind of chicken type. Maybe not a chicken, I don't know, but the feathers, again, we think of it so typically as birds. And that's maybe a little bit dramatic. Here's another artist's interpretation of what the velociraptor may have looked like. If we can bring that up, make it a little larger. So, but again, a very different, there it is for size comparison, you know, maybe about the size of a large turkey. So it's a very different organism than pictured in the Steven Spielberg version. So just be aware of that. But the main point here is that all of the theropod dinosaurs had feathers, and they were an important function. And the velociraptor may have even used these. There's some evidence that they used their forelimbs for stability and running, and then eventually perhaps even for gliding, although that may not have been pronounced in the velociraptor, but in other raptor species for gliding. And then we had a slow stepwise progression towards true flight. Okay? And many of those steps we have only limited evidence for and data, and so a lot of that is making extrapolations from those limited sets of data. Okay? But feathers are a theropod dinosaur feature, and birds are just the last living remnant of those theropod dinosaurs and have very diverse and advanced feathers. Okay, so just remember that. So that's in a nutshell what we understand about the origin of the feathers. In that Chen et al. Paper, there's some more information. Now, I also in the papers folder posted a paper 10b. It's really more of a bonus paper. If you want to take a look at it, do. I'm not going to ask any questions on the exam on it, but it's some new evidence looking at the genetic origins of hair in mammals. And this is a good example of deep homology. So maybe if just learn one thing, that hair and feathers may actually be from a very ancient ancestral structure, the scale. There's now some limited evidence that the hairs in mammals evolved as a modification of very, very ancient synapsid, and maybe even more ancient than that in the synapsid ancestors, but as a synapsid scale, and eventually was modified into the modern hair follicle. And before that, we just thought that they were separate, completely independent origins. So if you want to take a look at 10b, it'll go into some detail about that, but as long as you know that hairs in mammals may be an example of a deep homology and be connected at a very deep level to ancestral structure that also gave rise to the feather, that's all you need to know.